Another late night, huh? Greg's voice was warm and familiar as Shelley stepped through the front door. The house smelled like freshly brewed coffee, a scent that usually comforted her, but tonight it only amplified the guilt gnawing at her insides. She forced a smile, dropping her purse on the console table by the entrance. Yeah, the girls wanted to stay out a bit longer. You know how it is. Her voice was light, casual, as if she had spent the evening with friends instead of wrapped in the arms of another man. Greg chuckled, his blue eyes crinkling at the corners as he set down his book. Of course. You deserve a break after all the hard work you've been putting in. As he moved towards her, his steps were unhurried, confident. Greg had always been like that, steady, reliable, the kind of man anyone would trust implicitly. He pulled her into a hug, the warmth of his body enveloping her. But instead of the usual comfort it brought, Shelley felt a cold wave of guilt. I missed you tonight, he murmured into her hair, his lips brushing against her forehead. Shelley's heart clenched. I missed you too, she replied, the lie slipping out before she could stop it. She told herself that it wasn't a complete lie. There was a part of her that did miss him, missed the simplicity of their life before everything got so complicated. Greg pulled back slightly to look at her, his hands resting on her shoulders. You look tired. Was it a rough night? Just a lot of talking. You know how it is with Olivia and the girls. Shelley tried to laugh, but it came out strained. She searched his face, wondering if he could see through her, if he noticed the cracks in her facade. Greg's gaze softened, and he stroked her cheek with his thumb. Well, don't overdo it. You need to take care of yourself too, not just everyone else. His concern only made her feel worse. She leaned into his touch, closing her eyes for a moment. She wished she could tell him everything, confess all her sins and beg for his forgiveness. But she knew it wasn't that simple. She was in too deep, and there was no easy way out. You know, Olivia was asking about you today, Greg said, breaking the silence. He dropped his hand from her face and took a step back, giving her some space. She said you two should hang out more often. Shelley's heart skipped a beat. Oh yeah. She forced herself to sound casual, keeping her voice steady. Maybe we should. It's been a while since we had a girls' night, just the two of us. Yeah, you should. It'd be good for you. Greg's tone was light, but there was something in his eyes, something that made her uneasy. Sure, she agreed quickly. I'll talk to her about it. Greg nodded, seemingly satisfied with her response. Well, I'm heading to bed. Don't stay up too late. He leaned in to give her a kiss on the forehead, a gesture so simple and sweet it almost broke her. I won't, she promised, watching as he turned and walked upstairs. She listened to his footsteps, the creak of the floorboards, and the soft click of the bedroom door closing behind him. Shelley sat down on the couch, her body sinking into the cushions as if the weight of her lies was finally catching up to her. She stared at the coffee table, her mind racing. Something was off, but she couldn't put her finger on it. Greg had always been trusting, never questioning her excuses or her late nights. But tonight, there was something different about him, something that made her uneasy. She shook her head, trying to push the thoughts away. She was just being paranoid, she told herself. Everything was under control. Greg was too busy with his own projects to suspect anything, too trusting to doubt her. But as she sat there in the dimly lit living room, she couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in on her. She thought about Jacob, about their last meeting. He had been more intense than usual, pressing her for answers about their future. She had managed to deflect, to buy herself some time, but she knew it was only a matter of time before he demanded more. She reached for her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen. She wanted to text Jacob, to tell him that she couldn't keep doing this, that it was all too much, but she knew she wouldn't. The thrill, the danger, the excitement, it was all too intoxicating. She couldn't give it up, not yet. Instead, she opened her text messages and quickly deleted their entire conversation. She had been careful from the start, covering her tracks, making sure there was no evidence that could lead Greg to the truth. She used a separate phone for their calls, one that she kept hidden away, only taking it out when she was sure Greg was out of the house. She had even concocted stories about spending time with Olivia, using her best friend as a cover for her illicit activities. Shelley knew it wasn't fair to Greg, but she couldn't stop herself. The affair with Jacob was like a drug, a high she couldn't resist. It wasn't that she wanted to hurt Greg, but the thrill, the excitement, it was like nothing she had ever felt before. With Jacob, she felt alive, free from the mundane routine of her everyday life. But sitting here now, alone in the quiet of her living room, she felt anything but free. The lies were closing in on her, suffocating her, and she didn't know how much longer she could keep up the charade. "You're being ridiculous," she muttered to herself, rubbing her temples. She had everything under control. Greg had no idea what was really going on, and he never would. She just needed to be more careful, that's all. But the unease lingered, gnawing at her, whispering that something was about to change, that her perfect illusion was on the verge of shattering. She pushed the thought away, forcing herself to believe that she could keep everything from falling apart. After all, she had done it this long, hadn't she? With a deep breath, Shelley stood up and made her way upstairs, careful not to wake Greg as she slipped into bed beside him. She watched him sleep for a moment, the rise and fall of his chest, the peaceful expression on his face. She wished she could feel that peace, that certainty, but all she felt was the weight of her secrets pressing down on her. As she closed her eyes, willing herself to sleep, she couldn't help but wonder how much longer she could keep up the act. How much longer before Greg saw through her lies and everything came crashing down. But for now, all she could do was hold on, keep pretending, and hope that the perfect illusion she had created would hold a little longer. The next few weeks were a whirlwind for Shelley. She met Jacob in hotels, parking lots, and even his office after hours. Each encounter was a stolen moment filled with passion and sex, but as thrilling as it was also exhausting. The constant lying, the cover stories, the sneaking around, it all took its toll. Shelley found herself becoming more and more paranoid, jumping at every unexpected sound, checking her phone obsessively, and overanalyzing every word Greg said. One evening, Shelley sat across from Jacob in a restaurant. They were supposed to be enjoying a quiet dinner together, but instead, they were in the middle of a heated argument. "We can't keep doing this forever, Shelley," Jacob said, his voice low but intense. He leaned in closer, his eyes locked on hers. "When are you going to leave, Greg? We've been talking about this for months." Shelley sighed, running a hand through her hair. "It's not that simple, Jacob. You know that." "What's not simple about it?" Jacob asked, frustration evident in his tone. "You don't love him anymore, right? So why stay? We could be together, start over. You just have to make a decision." "And what about Olivia?" Shelley shot back, her voice rising. "It's not just about me. You're married too, remember?" Jacob's expression hardened. "Olivia and I are done. We've been done for a long time. I'm ready to move on, but it feels like you're just stringing me along." Shelley stared at him, feeling cornered. She wanted to be with Jacob, but the idea of leaving Greg, of blowing up her entire life, terrified her. She didn't know how to respond, so she fell silent, looking down at her glass of wine. Jacob sighed, rubbing his temples in frustration. "I'm tired of waiting, Shelley. You need to make a choice." The tension between them was palpable, and for a moment, Shelley thought he might get up and leave. But instead, he leaned back in his chair and shook his head. "I'll give you some time to think," he said quietly, "but I can't do this much longer." Shelley nodded, grateful that the conversation was over, at least for now. She knew he was right, but the weight of the decision felt overwhelming. After they finished their meal in silence, she made an excuse to leave early, needing space to clear her head. As she drove home that night, her mind was a storm of conflicting emotions. She pulled into the driveway, sat in her car for a few minutes, and tried to compose herself before going inside. The house was dark, except for a light in the kitchen. When she opened the door, she was startled to see Greg sitting at the table, nursing a cup of coffee. His presence there, at this hour, was unusual. "Greg," she said, her voice tinged with surprise as she stepped into the kitchen. Greg looked up at her, and Shelley noticed the strange look in his eyes, an intensity that made her uneasy. "Hey," he said softly, his voice calm but with an edge she hadn't heard before. "You're home late again." Shelley swallowed, trying to gauge his mood. "Yeah, the girls wanted to stay out longer. You know how it is." She gave him a strained smile, hoping it would defuse the tension. Greg didn't return her smile. Instead, he stared at her for a moment longer than was comfortable before finally nodding. "Right. The girls." An awkward silence settled between them. Shelley felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach, but she forced herself to stay composed. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice carefully measured. Greg nodded slowly, but his gaze never left her. "Yeah, everything's fine. Just thinking about a few things." Shelley's heart raced. "What kind of things?" Greg shrugged, his expression unreadable. "Just life, I guess. Us. Where we're headed." The way he said it made Shelley's throat tighten. She tried to laugh it off, but it sounded hollow. "Well, don't overthink it. I'm here if you need to talk." Greg gave her a small, tight-lipped smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Thanks, I appreciate that." He stood up, his movements slow and deliberate, and walked to the sink to rinse out his cup. Shelley watched him, feeling like there was something important left unsaid, something she wasn't seeing. "You should get some rest," Greg said as he dried his hands. "You look tired." "I will," Shelley replied, feeling dismissed. She watched as he turned off the kitchen light and walked out of the room without another word. As soon as he was gone, Shelley let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Something had shifted between them, and she couldn't shake the feeling that Greg knew more than he was letting on. The strange look in his eyes, the way he had spoken to her. It all felt off, but she didn't know what to make of it. She made her way upstairs, her mind racing with thoughts. Was Greg starting to suspect something? Had she slipped up? She went through the events of the past few weeks, trying to pinpoint where things might have gone wrong, but nothing stood out. She had been careful, hadn't she? As she lay in bed that night, listening to Greg's steady breathing beside her, Shelley couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over her. She stared at the ceiling, her mind replaying their conversation over and over, trying to decipher the hidden meaning behind his words. Had he seen something? Heard something? Or was it just her own guilt twisting everything, making her paranoid? The next morning, things seemed to return to normal. Greg was his usual self, kind, attentive, and focused on his work. But Shelley couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, even if she couldn't put her finger on what it was. As the days passed, she found herself watching him more closely, trying to gauge his mood, his actions. Every little thing he did seemed to take on a new significance, and she couldn't tell if she was reading too much into it, or if there really was something there. Every time he looked at her, she felt like he was scrutinizing her, like he was searching for something. Greg, however, gave no indication that anything was wrong. He continued to go about his day, attending meetings, working on projects, and making small talk with her as if nothing had changed. But the doubt gnawed at Shelley, growing with each passing day. The stress of maintaining her double life started to weigh on her. She became more distant, more distracted, and Greg noticed. "Is everything okay with you?" he asked one evening as they sat on the couch, watching TV. Shelley nodded quickly, too quickly. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just work has been stressful." Greg studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, just let me know if you need anything." Shelley forced a smile. "I will. Thanks." But even as she said it, she could feel the distance between them widening. It was like a chasm that she couldn't cross, no matter how hard she tried. The weight of her secrets was becoming unbearable, and she didn't know how much longer she could keep pretending. She started avoiding Jacob, making excuses to cut their meetings short or cancel them altogether. He noticed, of course, and their conversations became more strained, more tense. "You're pulling away," he accused one evening as they sat in his car, parked in a secluded spot. "I'm not," Shelley protested, but even she didn't believe it. "Then what's going on? You're acting different." "It's just everything's getting more complicated," Shelley admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Jacob sighed, running a hand through his hair. "We need to figure this out, Shelley. We can't keep doing this forever." "I know," she said, her heart heavy with the weight of her choices. "I know." But even as she said it, She didn't know what she was going to do. The walls were closing in, and she was running out of time. The night of the incident began just like the many others that had come before it. Shelley had dressed carefully, choosing a sleek white dress that she knew Jacob loved. She kissed Greg goodbye, telling him she was off to meet Olivia for dinner. Greg smiled at her, the same warm smile that always made her heart ache with guilt, and wished her a good night. As she drove to their usual hotel, Shelley's thoughts drifted to Jacob. She knew he was getting impatient, that he wanted her to make a decision soon. But tonight, she didn't want to think about any of that. She just wanted to lose herself in the passion that had kept their affair alive for so long. When she arrived at the hotel, Jacob was already waiting for her in the room. The moment she stepped through the door, he pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a hunger that matched her own. They spent the wild night wrapped in each other, their connection as electric as ever, oblivious to everything outside that room. Hours later, as dawn approached, Shelley reluctantly slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Jacob. She dressed quickly, her mind already shifting back to her life with Greg. She knew she had to get home before he woke up, had to make sure her lies remained intact. The drive back home was quiet, the streets empty in the early morning light. But as she turned onto her street, a sense of unease settled over her. The house, usually warm and inviting, looked different in the gray light of dawn. The lights were off, except for a faint glow coming from the upstairs bedroom window. Shelley's heart began to race as she pulled into the driveway. Something was wrong. She could feel it in her bones. She hurried up the front steps, fumbling with her keys, and pushed open the door. The house was eerily silent, the kind of silence that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She paused in the hallway, listening for any sound, but there was nothing. The living room was dark, the kitchen empty. The only light was coming from upstairs. Taking a deep breath, Shelley climbed the stairs, her heart pounding louder with each step. As she reached the top of the stairs, she saw that the bedroom door was slightly ajar. The dim light from inside spilled into the hallway, casting long shadows on the walls. She hesitated for a moment, fear rooting her to the spot, but then she forced herself to move forward. She pushed open the door, and the sight that greeted her made her blood run cold. There, in the middle of their bed, were Greg and Olivia and fully naked, wrapped in each other's arms. The sheets were tangled around them, their clothes discarded carelessly on the floor. For a moment, Shelley couldn't breathe. It felt like the ground had been ripped out from under her. Olivia was the first to notice her. She looked up and a slow, smug smile spread across her face. "Oh, look who's finally home," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Shelley felt like she had been punched in the gut. "What the fuck is going on here?" she demanded, her voice trembling with shock and anger. Olivia chuckled, a low, mocking sound. She pulled the sheet around her naked body and sat up, looking at Shelley with disdain. "What does it look like, bitch? Your hubby is mine now." Shelley's eyes darted to Greg, hoping for some kind of explanation, some denial that this was all some terrible mistake. But Greg just stared at her with cold, emotionless eyes, so different from the man she thought she knew. Without a word, he reached over to the nightstand and grabbed a stack of papers. He tossed them at her feet, the pages scattering across the floor. "Here," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Your divorce papers. Pack your shit, get the fuck out of my house right now." Shelley stood frozen, staring down at the papers. The word divorce in bold letters at the top of the page seemed to blur before her eyes. This couldn't be happening. Not like this. "Greg, please, what are you talking about?" she began, her voice breaking. "Let me explain." But Greg cut her off with a wave of his hand, his expression hardening. "There's nothing to explain, Shelley. I've known about your affair for a long time. And while you were busy sneaking around with Jacob, I was busy planning my revenge." Shelley felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She had underestimated Greg, taken his kindness for weakness, and now she was paying the price. "Revenge?" she echoed, disbelief coloring her words. Greg nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Did you really think I wouldn't find out? You've been so careless, Shelley. Deleting texts, sneaking off at night. It was only a matter of time before you slipped up." Shelley's mind raced as she tried to comprehend what he was saying. She had been careful, hadn't she? But as she looked into Greg's eyes, she realized that he had seen through her all along. "You're a fool, Shelley," Olivia said, breaking the silence. She leaned back against the headboard, a satisfied smile on her lips. "You really thought you could have it all? A loving husband and a lover on the side? How stupid are you?" Shelley's anger flared, but it was quickly extinguished by the crushing weight of the situation. "You set this up," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You wanted me to find you here, didn't you?" "Of course," Greg replied coolly. "I wanted you to know that I'm not as blind as you thought I was. And I wanted you to feel just a fraction of the betrayal you've put me through." Tears welled up in Shelley's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She couldn't believe how thoroughly Greg had outmaneuvered her. "So this is it? You're just going to throw me out?" Greg's expression didn't change. "You made your choice, Shelley. Now you have to live with the consequences." Olivia laughed softly, as if the whole situation was just a game to her. "I guess this is what you get for playing with fire, huh?" Shelley's chest tightened as the reality of her situation set in. She had lost everything: her marriage, her home, her life as she knew it, all because of her own selfish actions. She looked at Greg one last time, hoping for some sign of the man she had once loved, but all she saw was a stranger. Without another word, Shelley turned and walked out of the bedroom, her legs trembling beneath her. She descended the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last, until she reached the front door. As she stepped outside, the early morning air was cool against her skin, but it did nothing to numb the pain that had taken root in her heart. She stood on the porch for a moment, looking back at the house that had once been her sanctuary. Now it was just a place filled with memories she could never reclaim. With a deep breath, she turned and walked away, knowing that her life would never be the same again. The days after Shelley was kicked out of her home blurred together into a haze of despair and confusion. She found herself in a small motel on the edge of town, the only place she could afford with the little money she had left. The room smelled faintly of mildew, and the wallpaper was peeling at the corners, but it was all she had. Shelley sat on the edge of the stiff bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. The first morning after the incident, Shelley woke up disoriented, her mind struggling to grasp the reality of her situation. The night before, she had walked aimlessly through the dark streets, her emotions swinging between anger and grief. Now, in the harsh light of day, the weight of her decisions crashed down on her. She had lost everything: her home, her marriage, her friends, all because of her own selfishness. She glanced at her phone, which sat lifeless on the nightstand. She had no one to call, no one who would listen to her side of the story. The silence was deafening, a constant reminder of the isolation she now faced. She hadn't heard from Greg or Olivia since that night, and a part of her was relieved. But another part, the part that still clung to the hope that this was all a nightmare, wanted to hear Greg's voice, to beg him to take her back, to forgive her. But she knew that was impossible. Greg had been preparing for this for years, carefully gathering evidence of her affair, building his case until he was ready to strike. And when he did, it had been swift and brutal. There was no room for forgiveness in his plan. Shelley pulled herself together enough to try and piece her life back together. She spent the days making calls, searching for a new job, something to anchor her in this new reality. But everywhere she turned, doors were slammed in her face. Greg and Olivia had made sure of that. The rumors and lies they had spread about her had taken root, painting her as the villain in every story. Her lover also dumped her and found another woman. One afternoon, as she sat in the motel's tiny lobby, scrolling through job listings on her phone, she overheard two women talking at the front desk. "Did you hear about Shelley?" one of them whispered, not bothering to lower her voice. "I heard she was cheating on Greg for years. He finally found out and kicked her out on the spot. Can you believe it?" The other woman shook her head, her expression one of disgust. "Serves her right. I always thought there was something off about her. Poor Greg, he didn't deserve that." Shelley felt her face flush with shame. It didn't matter that they didn't know she was sitting just a few feet away, hearing every word. The truth was, they weren't entirely wrong. She had betrayed Greg, and now she was paying the price. She couldn't argue with that. As the weeks dragged on, Shelley fell into a routine. She would wake up early, try to find work, and then spend the rest of the day trying to avoid the stares and whispers of the people who had once been her neighbors and friends. Every time she passed someone on the street, she could feel their eyes on her, could hear the judgment in their voices as they whispered behind her back. "There she goes, the homewrecker," they would say, their words cutting deep. But the hardest part was the nights. Alone in her motel room, Shelley would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of that night over and over in her mind. The look on Greg's face as he handed her the divorce papers, the smug satisfaction in Olivia's eyes, it haunted her. She had underestimated Greg, taken his kindness for weakness, and now she was suffering the consequences. One night, as she lay in bed, Shelley's phone buzzed on the nightstand. She picked it up, her heart skipping a beat when she saw it was a message from an unknown number. "How's motel life, Shelley? Not quite the same as your cozy little house, is it?" the message read. Shelley's hands trembled as she read the words. She had no doubt who the message was from. Greg. She could almost see the cold smile on his face as he typed those words. He wasn't done with her, not by a long shot. He wanted her to suffer, to feel every ounce of pain he believed she had caused him. In the days that followed, the messages continued. Sometimes they were simple taunts, reminders of what she had lost. "Remember when we used to sit on the porch and watch the sunset? Hope you're enjoying the view from your motel room." Other times, they were more vicious. "You destroyed everything, Shelley. You don't deserve happiness." Shelley knew she should block the number, but a part of her couldn't bring herself to do it. The messages were a twisted lifeline, a connection to the life she had lost. But they also served as a constant reminder of how far she had fallen. She started to notice other strange things too. Her car, parked outside the motel, was keyed one morning, deep scratches marring the paint. Another time, she returned to her room to find the door slightly ajar, the contents of her suitcase thrown across the floor. Nothing was missing, but the violation was clear. The fear that had been gnawing at her since that night began to grow, a cold knot in her stomach that never went away. Greg's revenge wasn't just about kicking her out of the house or spreading rumors. It was something deeper, something more sinister. He wanted to destroy her, to strip away every ounce of dignity she had left. As the days turned into weeks, Shelley realized she was trapped. Greg had built his life around revenge, and now she was the target. There was no escaping it. All she could do was wait, helplessly, as he continued to tighten the noose around her. But as the weeks turned into months, Shelley began to see a different side to her situation. She had nothing left to lose. Greg had taken everything from her, and in doing so, he had freed her from the life she had once clung to so desperately. The fear was still there, but so was something else, a flicker of defiance, a tiny spark of resilience. She had made mistakes, and she had paid for them, but she wasn't going to let Greg control her any longer. As she stood in the bathroom of her motel room one morning, staring at her reflection in the mirror, Shelley made a decision. She wasn't going to let Greg destroy her. He had already taken so much, but he couldn't take her will to fight back. She would rebuild her life, piece by piece, no matter how long it took. And as she walked out of the motel room, leaving behind the shattered remnants of her old life, Shelley felt a sense of determination she hadn't felt in a long time. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let Greg win. Shelley found herself living a life she no longer recognized. The betrayal from Greg and Olivia had left her shattered, but there was no time to wallow in self-pity. She had to rebuild her life, even as the world she once knew turned its back on her. She moved to a new part of town, far from the familiar places that now held only painful memories. The small apartment she rented was modest, a stark contrast to the home she had shared with Greg, but it was a start. Shelley managed to secure a job at a small marketing firm. It was enough to keep her afloat. Each day was a struggle, a reminder of the mistakes that had cost her everything. The work was tedious, and the pay was barely enough to cover her bills, but it was work, and it gave her a sense of purpose in a life that had been stripped of meaning. The office was a small, cramped space with outdated furniture and fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead. Shelley was given a desk in the corner, near the break room, where the smell of stale coffee lingered in the air. Her co-workers were polite but distant, unaware of her past and uninterested in getting to know her. She was just another employee, another face in the crowd, and that was exactly how she wanted it. Every morning, Shelley would sit at her desk, typing away at her computer, trying to lose herself in the monotony of spreadsheets and emails. But no matter how hard she worked, she couldn't escape the thoughts that gnawed at her. She replayed the events of that fateful night over and over in her mind, wondering where it had all gone wrong. How had she let her life spiral so far out of control? Meanwhile, Greg and Olivia's lives seemed to flourish. The scandal had driven their respective spouses into hiding, with Jacob and Shelley becoming pariahs in their social circle. The gossip had spread like wildfire, and soon enough, everyone knew about the affairs, the betrayals, and the bitter breakups. Greg and Olivia, on the other hand, had used the situation to their advantage. They filed for divorce from their cheating partners swiftly and quietly, making sure everything was settled out of the public eye. Once the dust had settled, Greg and Olivia began to see each other openly. No longer needing to hide behind pretenses, they moved in together, blending their lives seamlessly. Greg sold the house he had shared with Shelley, and together, they bought a new one. A beautiful, sprawling property on the outskirts of town. It was everything they had ever wanted, a symbol of their new life together. The house was warm and inviting, with large windows that let in plenty of natural light. The garden was meticulously maintained, a place where their children would one day play. It was a far cry from the cold, sterile home that Shelley now inhabited. Greg and Olivia filled their new home with laughter and love, creating memories that would last a lifetime. Soon after, they got married in a small, intimate ceremony. It was a celebration of their victory, a final triumph over the deceit and betrayal they had endured. The wedding was a simple affair, attended only by their closest friends and family. Olivia wore a simple white dress, and Greg looked dashing in a tailored suit. As they exchanged vows, there was a sense of closure, of putting the past behind them and looking toward the future. The years that followed were kind to them. Greg's career continued to thrive, and Olivia became a well-known figure in their community, respected for her work in charity and social events. They were the golden couple, the epitome of success and happiness. Their story was one of redemption, of finding love in the most unexpected places. Before long, they welcomed 2 children into their lives, a boy and a girl. Their family became the picture of happiness, a testament to the idea that sometimes, out of the ashes of betrayal, something beautiful could emerge. Greg and Olivia found solace in each other, their shared experiences only strengthening their bond. The children brought joy and laughter into their home, erasing the shadows of the past. Their son, Jaden, was a spirited child with a love for adventure. He spent his days exploring the garden, climbing trees, and imagining himself as a brave knight on a quest. His sister, Lily, was quieter, more introspective, with a love for books and art. She would spend hours drawing, her small hands covered in colorful smudges. Greg and Olivia doted on their children, giving them the love and attention they had both longed for in their previous marriages. Greg and Olivia had both suffered at the hands of their former spouses, but in the end, they had come out on top. They had not only survived but thrived, turning their pain into a foundation for a future filled with joy. They took family vacations to the mountains, spent weekends at the beach, and hosted dinner parties for their friends. Their life was full, rich, and deeply satisfying. As for Shelley and Jacob, they faded into obscurity, haunted by their mistakes. The lives they had once known were gone, replaced by the bitter taste of regret. Shelley had heard that Jacob had moved away with another woman, starting over in a new city where no one knew his past. She thought about reaching out to him once or twice, but each time, she stopped herself. There was nothing left to say, no comfort to be found in each other's misery. Shelley was left to reflect on the choices that had led to her downfall, living with the knowledge that she had been outmaneuvered at every turn. She spent her evenings alone in her apartment, the silence heavy and oppressive. Sometimes, she would pour herself a glass of wine and sit on the balcony, staring out at the city lights and wondering what might have been. And so, As the years went by, Greg and Olivia lived the life they had always dreamed of, a life of love, trust, and unwavering loyalty. They had been through the fire and come out the other side, stronger and more united than ever. Together, they built a legacy that would last for generations, a legacy rooted in the revenge that had brought them together and the love that had kept them there. In the end, their story was not just one of revenge, but of redemption, proving that even in the darkest of times, there could be light, and from the ruins of a broken past, a new and better future could be born. Greg and Olivia's love became a beacon, a reminder that sometimes, out of the deepest pain, the strongest bonds are forged. They had found happiness in each other, and in that happiness, they had found peace.